Pathfinder's complicated sometimes. Also, you're out of milk. It's no doubt that Pathfinder has a reputation for being complicated, and if you look at Pathfinder 1st Edition, it's easy to understand why. Hell, just look at the video games and the crazy amount of buffs you can stack on top of each other to get insanely high numbers, usually even bigger than the numbers you see in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, even though Pathfinder 2nd Edition talks about huge numbers. It's kind of weird when you think about it and really look deep into it. I should make a video about that someday. But I'm not here to talk about Pathfinder 1st Edition, I'm here to talk about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Because I like it more. There are 23 freaking classes in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, with 4 more on the way next year. Yes, I know, we are approaching 30 announced classes for this game within 4 years. It's kinda wild. So understandably, some of them are going to be more complex than the others. In today's video, I'm going to be going over all 23 officially released classes for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, most of them in their remastered form, except for a few of them that were released in supplementary books like Secrets of Magic. Those haven't been remastered yet, but they might get a remaster at some point. The ranking of these classes are going to be based on one single thing: how much I personally recommend that class for a beginner. This will be going in order of most recommended to least recommended. Effectively, the earlier in the video, the more I recommend it for a beginner player, and by the end of the list, I will have 2 or 3 classes that I recommend beginners never touch unless they have a firm understanding of the game's mechanics, even if they've never played it. But at that point, are you really a beginner? Food for thought. The classes are all going to be ranked based on 3 aspects: ease of creating a character of that class, ease of using that class in combat, and a general ease of understanding that class's mechanics and how they mesh with the mechanics of the system. Basically, if a class bends or cheats the rules of the system, I'm going to put it on the more advanced end of the spectrum than something that doesn't break the rules. So, please leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I am approaching like a 50% watch rate from unsubscribed people, and I haven't made this joke in like 2 years, back when it was funny. Also, I want to give a huge shout out to all the members of the No Net One's Patreon on screen right now, and a special thank you to World's Tallest Hobbit, who is highlighted there on the list, for being the first of the 4 open spots for a one-shot GM'd by yours truly. If you're unaware, there are 3 spots left at this tier where I will run a one-shot for you and up to 4 of your friends. I've actually been asked a few times, so I want to clarify, only 1 person buys this tier, and I run the game for you and up to 4 of your friends. That tier buys the entire one-shot for up to 5 players. It's not that price per player. So if you and your friends want to pool the money together to have a one-shot hosted by me where none of you have to GM and you can all play alongside each other in a 5-hour-long one-shot, click the link in the description and check it out. I really appreciate you, World's Tallest Hobbit, as well as the rest of the No Net One's Patreon members. Y'all are what make this job possible, and I thank you more and more every single day. Alright, let's jump into these rankings with the most obvious placement on this list. Coming in at rank 1 for the simplest class you can play and the ultimate class for beginners, the Fighter. Let's be honest, we all knew Fighter was going to be the most beginner-friendly class on this list. Their character creation is so simple. You get so many of your features just automatically. They don't have a subclass. Pretty much all you're picking as a fighter is a first-level class feat and a weapon. And you're probably just going to pick the class feat that augments your weapon. Oh, you're going to wield 2 weapons? You should probably take Double Strike. Oh, you're going to take a great weapon? You should probably take Vicious Swing. It is so simple and easy to understand, and I love the design path that Paizo took with the Fighter, making all of their feats support specific types of weapon, and the Fighter class's progression rewarding you for focusing on one type of weapon. Very cool, easy to understand. In combat, again, just do what your weapon is best at. Are you a ranged fighter? Cool, just shoot people over and over again from the back line. Are you a great weapon? Cool, just hit people over and over again on the front line. Sure, you can make a fighter a little bit more complex if you choose to, by throwing in some grapple synergy, maybe sword and board, or even going as far as using multiple different types of weapons, but at its core, the Fighter is pick a weapon, you're the best in the world at it, go have fun. And as far as mechanical understanding, as long as you understand the basics of combat of armor class, hit points, and damage die, you're golden. That's all you need to know as a fighter. You use your weapon, you make your attack roll, you get a critical hit, you laugh maniacally. Snugglepuff. Coming in right above fighter, honestly not that much more complicated, is the Barbarian. Now, Barbarians are definitely notably more complex than fighters. They have a subclass. That subclass does some funky stuff. They get some class features that change things around. They've got their rage mechanic, but all in all, as long as you have raged, which is a free action when you roll initiative now in the remaster, you're basically just a slightly less accurate fighter who hits for way more flavorful damage. You're a giant, cool, you've got a giant hammer and you bonk people with it for bonus damage. You're a draconic instinct, cool, you've got a giant hammer and you bonk people with it for fire damage. Similar to fighters, they can be made more complex. Some subclasses are more complicated than others. You know, the Superstition Barbarian is a lot more complex than the Fury. No one plays Fury, I'm sorry. But even their first level feats are pretty much just like, yeah, get in there, go do stuff. Sudden charge, you're gonna run in and bonk a person. Barbarians are delightfully simple and incredibly satisfying, especially on those critical hits where you get to double all of your damage. And just like the fighter, you get in, you do what weapon you have equipped is best at bonking people. And mechanically, as long as you understand your rage mechanic, there's not that much more to understand besides fighter, unless you plan to use a concentrate action, which can be a little more complicated if you are already raging. Coming in at the third most beginner-friendly class is the Ranger. Yes, there's going to be a lot of martial classes up front because, as it stands, spellcasting is inherently more complicated, and I'm not going to just write that off because they just happen to be spellcasters. You know, spellcasting is inherently not beginner-friendly, so something like the Ranger, which has the martial simplicity of a fighter with a little bit more complexity of the hunt-prey aspect, similar to the Barbarian's Rage, and the addition of Warden focus spells, make Rangers a really good entry point if someone wants to experience everything the system has to offer. A little bit of combat, a little bit of unique actions, and a little bit of spellcasting all in one class. Character creation is super simple. You pick one of 3 subclasses, which upgrades your hunt prey feature and future attacks against that prey, and you basically just pick a weapon similar to a fighter. Are you a dual wielder? Are you a big weapon? Are you a ranged attacker? That's really simple and easy to understand. And if you want to get a little more complex on the battlefield, you can take the Animal Companion at first level, which gains the benefits of your hunt prey. There are levels of complexity to the Ranger if you so choose to pursue them. But if you want to be a crossbow ranger with precision and shoot people for 1d12 plus 1d8 every turn, more power to you. It's simple and it is satisfying. The only thing that makes combat a little bit more complicated for the Ranger is the required setup. Remember, if you want to get access to your subclass benefits, you do need to hunt prey. I've seen some new players playing a Ranger, and they'll just attack a random target, and me and the more experienced players at the table do need to remind them, like, hey, if you use an action to hunt them first, you'll get a bunch of bonus damage since you're precision, or your multiple attack penalty will be lower because you're flurry, or you're playing an outwit. Nobody plays outwit Rangers. Coming in at the 4th most recommended, and I would call these the Golden 4. If it is your first session of Pathfinder, play one of these top 4 classes if you want a simple, really enjoyable experience where you will feel useful and applicable to most situations regardless of what you build. Number 4 is the Rogue. This one's much more recommended more so on roleplay than on the combat capabilities. The first 3, the Fighter, Barbarian, and Ranger, they're all excellent in combat. They will always feel great. And the Rogue will too, don't get me wrong. Positioning is just a little bit more important to make sure you have them off guard and are getting your sneak attack. But the reason Rogue is so high up on this list, or rather low on this list because it's low complexity, is because of their massive amounts of skill proficiencies. Being a new player who is trained in like 75% of the skills of the game feels amazing. It might be a little bit more complicated, yes, but it feels great to be playing a class where you are applicable to almost any scenario. You're doing diplomacy with the mayor, you're applicable. You're trying to scale a wall, you're applicable. You're trying to research a hidden god, you're applicable. You're trying to pickpocket the fighter because he's too busy smacking something with his great hammer, you're applicable. The feeling of being able to do something no matter what situation is fantastic for beginners because they do get to explore more of the system. That's what's really important about a lot of these classes that affects their placement on this list. How much of the system do you really get to explore when you play it for the first time? Character creation of a rogue is super simple, though there is a little bit more reading. They have, I believe, 5 subclasses in the remaster, but it's also really simple to understand. Each subclass uses a different ability score. Do you want to be a super smart rogue? You're a mastermind. Do you want to be a really strong rogue? You're a ruffian. Do you want to be a a classic sneaky rogue, you're a thief. They're not hard to understand, and the benefits that come with them are pretty simple as well. Number 5 is the champion. Yes, we are 5 for 5 on marshals being the simplest classes in the game, which, like, duh. But don't worry, there are marshals farther up this list, and would you believe me if I said the most complex class in the game is a marshal? But that's spoilers. The champion, as far as character creation is concerned, is pretty simple, though there are a few more choices to make, and notably a lot more restrictions than the other classes. The only restrictions we've seen in the other classes up to this point is the Barbarian's Anathema, which is usually really easy to avoid. But the champion comes with Anathema not only from their chosen subclass, but also from their chosen sanctification, which you need to understand how that works, and their chosen deity that they are serving. There are so many things that roleplay wise a champion is not allowed to do. For example, if you are good, you can't murder an innocent. Obviously that seems super obvious up front, but it goes a lot deeper than that if you are playing with those restrictions firmly in place. There are a lot of tables that ignore these restrictions, in which case champion might be a little bit lower on this list. But I do still stand firm on champion being 5th in this list because of how vital their positioning is in combat. The other 4 classes we've talked about, positioning doesn't really matter unless maybe for the rogue, but flanking is super easy and everyone's going to be flanking anyway. But the champion, you need to not only take flanking into account, but you also need to make sure your allies are within 15 feet of you, and the enemies that can hurt them are also within 15 feet of you, and you need to remember to use your champion's reaction when your ally gets hit if both them and the enemy that hit them are within 15 feet of you. And there's a lot to think about that can be pretty overwhelming to a new player. Experienced players think of this as nothing. You know, with the champion's reaction, you know, oh, they're both next to me, champion's reaction reduced the damage. But for a new player, again, similar to the Rangers Hunt Prey, I've seen a lot of new player champions, myself included, who will go a full round completely forgetting their reaction exists. I'm pretty sure there's a live play out there of me playing a champion and going like 2 full rounds of combat on the first or second session without using my champion's reaction a single time because I was just not paying attention. Some of these classes do get put up a little higher on this list just because of the attention required to the battlefield as a whole. But aside from all of that, the champion's mechanics are really simple. Use your reaction to reduce the damage allies take, hit enemies in the face, and probably wear some heavy armor, maybe a shield if you want to be super turtley, or use a great weapon. You can also play a ranged champion, but they don't get a ton of support. Coming in at number 6 is the Sorcerer, the first spellcaster on this list, and in my opinion, the most beginner-friendly spellcaster in the entirety of Pathfinder 2e. Character creation isn't too bad. It's easy to be overwhelmed when you see there's like 13 bloodlines to choose from, but once you realize that each bloodline basically just determines your casting tradition and your focus spells, as well as a couple spells added to your repertoire, you realize that they're not that big of a deal. I mean, they're a big deal, but it's easy to pick the one you want, especially if you're picking for flavor over anything else. Additionally, sorcerers are so beginner-friendly because they use spontaneous casting. Spontaneous casting compared to prepared casting, like a wizard, is inherently simpler and more free for the player. I'll put a link to my video right here for where I actually explain spontaneous versus prepared spellcasting, but the TLDR is prepared spellcasters need to pick and choose hyper-specific spells they can only cast each day, whereas sorcerers and other spontaneous casters just have a list of spells they can cast, and they can cast any of them they want as long as they have the appropriate spell slots still open. Otherwise, just use a cantrip. Sorcerers are so forgiving because you have access to all of your spells at all times, and aside from their focus spells from their bloodline, they don't really get that much more complicated. As long as you understand the basics of spell casting and focus spells, you understand the Sorcerer. And coming right above Sorcerer, honestly, I would call these two tied, is the Bard. At their core, the Bard and the Sorcerer are incredibly similar. Spontaneous casters who can use their spell slots to cast any spell they know. Nice and simple. The only reason I put Bard higher than Sorcerer is because alongside having focus spells and full spell casting, Bards also need to understand and balance their composition cantrips. These are quick one-action spells that they need to sort of juggle in between moving around the battlefield and casting full-on spells and cantrips, which can be tough because most spells are 2 actions, moving is an action, and the composition cantrip is an action. That's 4 actions if you want to do all of that, and you only get 3 actions per turn. That's math. But what I do give the Bard over the Sorcerer in beginner friendliness is their character creation. Their subclasses are some of the simplest in the game, basically just giving you a level 1 feat and access to some other feats. It does not give you much at all, so your Bard is pretty much entirely dependent on the spells you pick. In addition to that, passive buffs like Courageous Anthem really make a new player feel useful without having to do anything right or wrong. You know, as long as you use Courageous Anthem and you turn that fighter's hit into a crit, you, the new player, are going to feel fantastic, and most experienced players know to thank the Bard for letting that happen. You know, especially if it's a new player, experienced players typically want the newbie to feel comfortable and more so feel useful. So saying like, oh my god, thank you so much for the Courageous Anthem, this damage is like half you right now, Bard, can make the new player feel welcome, useful, applicable, happy they made this character, happy they made the choice to use in Courageous Anthem. It is a fantastic feeling for new players. The only thing that puts this more complicated than the Sorcerer is just balancing the action economy. I stuttered, but I'm not doing another take. Next class. Next up is another one that I would say is almost tied with Sorcerer and Bard. The three of these could honestly be interchangeable in their position on this list, and that is the Cleric. I'll be the first to say that Clerics are probably the easiest spellcaster to build in character creation, especially after the remaster. You have a decent wisdom score, maybe some dexterity and constitution, you are good. Your bonus heal spell slots, not only are they just free now, you don't need to put points into charisma to get more of them, but they just make you feel infinitely more useful and a little bit powerful, which is a great feeling for a new player. Most characters only get 2 or 3 spell slots at level 1. The Cleric gets 6. But what puts the Cleric higher than Bard and Sorcerer for me is the requirement of paying attention to every single party member on the battlefield. You need to make sure you know how everyone's doing, where they are. If you're going to cast something like Bless, you need to make sure your positioning is correct. You need to know when to heal somebody and which version of heal to use, touch, range, or area of effect. There's a lot to think about when it comes to a Cleric's turn in combat, and that can be a lot to put onto a new player. On top of all of that, they have access to the entire divine spell list at all times, right from level 1 when you want to prepare your spells for the day, which I already talked about how prepared casting is inherently more complicated than spontaneous casting. You will have to choose from every single level 1 divine spell every single day. Sure, most clerics are probably going to pick 2 or 3 spells they like and just prepare those every single day, but technically speaking, you have access to like 30 spells that you can fill your 2 extra spell slots with every day, and you need to decide which spell goes in which slot, or if you put 2 spells into both of the slots, you know, the same spell into both slots. There's a lot to consider, and that can be really overwhelming for a new player. How about we get back to a martial class with the Investigator? Investigator at its core is not that complicated, although character creation can be a massive headache because of the paragraphs of text you need to read on learning how to pursue a lead, what the lead does for you, how to devise a stratagem on the lead, whether you're going to devise an attack stratagem or a skill stratagem on the lead, how to clue your fellow allies in, and that's all before even reading and picking your subclass and first level feat. Now on the inverse side of the coin, their combat is super straightforward. You're going to devise a stratagem. Did you roll high? Attack that person. Did you roll low? Attack somebody else. Simple as that, really. Maybe you'll use a skill stratagem instead to demoralize someone or something. But overall, the Investigator is not hard to play, but it is not beginner friendly when it comes to understanding how the class works, especially in the scope of the entire system. The reason the Investigator is this high on the list is simply because it constantly bends and manipulates the game's mechanics itself. You know, normally when you make an attack roll, that's going to be your attack roll. You don't get a chance to see it beforehand. The Investigator does, which is crazy and might not make a whole lot of sense to a new player, especially if they are new to TTRPGs as a whole. Next up is the Gunslinger. Now, the Gunslinger's character creation is actually really simple. They don't have a whole lot to pick from aside from their subclass, which just gives them a couple little benefits, and then their first level feat. Now, firearms are inherently more complicated than your average ranged weapon because they have to reload, they have some different traits, and understanding how Fatal works has actually been really confusing for a lot of new players I've played with. The idea of your weapon damage dice changing on a critical hit and adding one on top of it just isn't super natural for a lot of people. And on the subject of the fatal trait, the Gunslinger's combat is easy. You're gonna shoot, you're gonna reload. You're gonna shoot, you're gonna reload. Maybe you have a fancy way to reload, which is awesome. The problem is that it's luck dependent. And this is where my list gets a little bit weird, because this list is not just entirely built on complexity. This is not a complexity tier list. If you want to see that, click right here. No, this is a beginner-friendly tier list, and I do not believe the Gunslinger is beginner-friendly, because yes, their critical hits are amazing and will make you feel like you just blew somebody's head off when you roll 3d12 at level 1. But the problem is that if you don't crit, this class feels awful. And there's some people out there, myself included, raise your hand if you've got awful dice luck. It doesn't matter that the Gunslinger is extra accurate with their guns. If you can't roll above a 10, like me, you're not going to get a critical hit most of the time, which feels really bad. Remember, a lot of firearms will do 1d8 base. You don't add anything to that. It is just 1d8, which becomes 3d12 on a crit. The damage difference is astronomical, but if you don't get a single crit for an entire combat and you're sitting there going 1d8, reload, maybe move, my turn's done. And then the Barbarian walks up to somebody with a longsword and goes 1d8 plus 4 plus 8. It feels pretty bad. A string of bad luck can really frustrate a new player, and if their first experience with Pathfinder is them doing almost no damage, they're probably not going to want to come back to it if they see everybody else doing massive numbers compared to them. It sucks, but it's just the reality of the class. Next up is the Thaumaturge. I think a lot of y'all might have expected this farther down the list on the not beginner-friendly scale, but let me make my case. I'll admit, their character creation is super overwhelming. It's very similar to the Investigator, where there are paragraphs on paragraphs of text, but at the end of the day, it's not that complicated. When you see a new monster, you roll to exploit vulnerability. Do they have a weakness? Cool. Your weapons now trigger that weakness. Do they not have a weakness? Cool. You invent a weakness that deals a little bit of extra damage, and your weapons now trigger that weakness. And you can only use one-handed weapons. It's right in their class features saying that your one-handed weapons automatically deal bonus damage, so you're always going to use a one-handed weapon. And sure, there are 9 implements to pick from, but at level 1, you pick one, and you get its level 1 benefit. That's it. At the end of the day, the Thaumaturge is a one-handed martial character with a little toy in their hand. So while the mechanics might look scary and overwhelming at first, especially to a new player, I think Thaumaturge is actually fairly approachable. Next up might shock some experienced players. I put the Monk above the Thaumaturge. And sadly, it's not necessarily for complexity. In fact, character creation is almost as simple as the fighter. You don't pick a subclass as a monk. Rather, you pick a level 1 feat, and most of those feats are different stances. Similar to how a fighter basically picks a weapon and then takes a feat for that weapon, the monk just picks a stance, and that stance becomes their weapon, unlocking new unarmed strikes while they're in that stance. Now, what makes the monk a lot higher on this list is the fact that they need to understand weapon traits, and especially understanding the traits attached to your stance is vital, which sort of means you need to know what the weapon traits do before you even finish building your character. Sure, a lot of people might just say, oh, wolf stance, that looks cool, and they get into combat and go, what the heck is backstabber? And then when they find out that backstabber is +1 damage while flanking, suddenly they might not want wolf stance as much. They might want tiger stance, or dragon stance, or crane stance, or any of the other crazy stances. They're all cool, but you have to really understand what they do, and they don't necessarily tell you what they do. You have to go digging to figure out what the traits attached to those weapons or unarmed strikes do. Additionally, if you're not utilizing those traits to the best of their ability, the monk can come across as incredibly weak. My friend was playing a monk using what's the drunken fist fainting stance? Stumbling stance. They were using stumbling stance, and we loved their character, but in combat, they just sort of felt not that exciting, especially compared to the fighter and the rogue, who were critically hitting and sneak attacking constantly, whereas the monk, a lot of players might see Flurry of Blows and get excited, but remember, Flurry of Blows uses the multiple attack penalty. It's not like D&D where you just get a bonus full attack. No, you get one attack at your full bonus, and then another attack at -5, -4 if it's agile. Now don't get me wrong, monks can absolutely be just as effective as a fighter, but it requires a lot more understanding of the game's in-depth mechanics, and that's why it's this high on the list. I put Druid here. I don't even know if I agree with myself at this point, but Druid is really hard to pin down because Druid complexity is entirely based on your subclass. For example, the Wild Order, or Untamed Order as it's called now, is a lot more complicated than the Leaf Order. You know, the Leaf Order gives you a familiar. Cool. The Untamed Order gives you access to Untamed Form, which gets new forms based on your character level, as well as feats you take, which gives you different forms which all function differently, as well as giving you Untamed Shift, which is different than Untamed Form, because Untamed Shift changes one specific part of your body, and then at a certain level it can change two parts of your... There's a lot to it, alongside being an entirely full prepared spellcaster, just like the Cleric, who has access to the entire primal spell list, but has to prepare specific spells every day from that list. The Druid is weird, because if you just play a spellcaster, I would have put it next to Cleric, but if you play anything else, any of their other subclasses, I put it a little bit higher on the list. It's weird. Druid could really go anywhere on this list above like number 5, and I would agree with you. Very similar to Druid, but farther up the list is Wizard. I think people might be shocked to see Wizard this high on the list, but the big thing holding them there is prepared spellcasting. Prepared spellcasting in Pathfinder 2e is brutal, and Wizards, unlike Clerics and Druids, don't have access to a full spell list. Now, I know I was talking about the full spell list being its own can of worms, but Wizard actually makes it a little bit more complicated in that you need to first learn spells, but just because you've learned a spell and transcribed it into your spell book doesn't mean you can cast it that day. At the beginning of each daily preparations, you need to prepare specific spells, but only from the spells you have learned and added to your spell book, which can be super frustrating. And then if you prepared the wrong spells that day, if you prepared all combat spells and it was nothing but roleplay, your wizard might end up feeling completely useless. I really can't put enough emphasis on how annoying and confusing learning and preparing spells can be for new players, especially if they're used to something like D&D where everyone just sort of casts whatever spells they know. This can be a real deal breaker for people, and I don't think it's a very beginner-friendly class, which is why the wizard is here towards the middle of the list. Swashbuckler. I am pretty happy with this placement of Swashbuckler because it sort of takes the fighter and the rogue and turns them into a dancer of sorts. You have a very specific pattern you need to learn and follow. Character creation is honestly pretty simple. It's just picking your subclass and your level 1 feat, though you do need to understand a lot of different aspects of the Swashbuckler's gameplay, namely panache, bravado, and finishers, and precise strike, and stylish combatant. The reason I say it's like a dance is because you sort of have to follow the same flow of motions in combat. Once you learn it, it's very simple, but a lot of people might not want to follow that exact steps every time at the beginning of the first session. That was an English sentence of words. Typically, you're going to want to do something with the bravado trait, gaining panache, attacking with precise strikes, maybe using a finisher to lose panache, and then repeat the cycle. It's very important to learn about the balance of gaining and spending your panache. A lot of people might lock right into the super easy dance of move, bravado, gain panache, finisher, move, bravado, gain panache, finisher. I've seen that a lot, but the Swashbuckler can do a lot more than that. Their precise strikes are super useful and don't need to be used right away on a finisher, and I do believe that that balance of gaining, holding, and spending panache really does skyrocket the Swashbuckler's complexity and lack of beginner familiarity. Not to say that that basic combo of gain finisher isn't that bad and would be super beginner friendly. I just think that the open-endedness of the Swashbuckler and the multitude of different terms it uses is why it's this high on the list. Next up is the Inventor. Now the Inventor is weird because at its core it's a very simple class. In fact, it's mainly just a martial class that can blow up. A big reason the Inventor is this high up on the list is because of the reading. Oh my gosh. All of the different innovations right at level 1. I think I counted it's like 28 different options to pick from. at level 1 and then you pick your level 1 class feat, there's a lot going on, and a lot of these options seem very insignificant. You know, they'll add a weapon trait, or give you reach, or give you some bonus to your armor or your companion based on which subclass you chose, and so that's the only reason the Inventor is this high up on the list. Their actual gameplay is pretty simple to follow, but in order to quote-unquote correctly build them, and to understand what you're doing, you need to understand the core mechanics of the game, as well as a lot of the detailed mechanics as well, like weapon traits. Very similar to the Monk, just with so many more options to pick from. And then Unstable's a whole thing as well, and all the different feats you can take that give you new unstable actions, which change based on your subclass. It's a lot. Okay, so everything we've talked about thus far has been relatively understandable. Even some of the ones I exaggerated a little bit, like the Swashbuckler. I think if a new player came up to me and said, hey, I want to play a Swashbuckler, or hey, I want to play an Inventor, I wouldn't say, are you sure about that? This might be too much. I would not say that at all. I think a brand new player, even to TTRPGs, could and probably would enjoy any of the classes I've listed so far. But going forward, we are taking a jump. I would consider everything else I'm going to talk about here today an advanced class. This doesn't mean you should never play it and that new players will never understand it, but it is going to take a lot more work and knowledge of the system to get the most out of these classes. So let's get into these advanced classes, starting with the Magus. Right off the bat, making a Magus feels like building a fighter and building a wizard at the exact same time. All of their subclasses support a very specific type of weapon, so you're probably only going to use that type of weapon. You know, if you're shooting star, you're ranged. If you're whatever, branching vines or whatever it is, you are staves. Staves? Staff. Each of those comes with a focus spell, so you need to understand how those work. They have their unique spell strike feature, which we will get into, plus the often forgotten arcane cascade feature, which is its own weird thing that requires an extra action. There's a lot going on with the Magus, on top of being a prepared spellcaster like the wizard, who needs to write down and learn all of their spells if they want to prepare them, and they only get 4 spell slots a day maximum to prepare spells they know. This is already so much, but their combat can also feel really awkward and clunky, especially if, just like the Gunslinger, you have really bad dice luck. And this is because when you spell strike, you can't just spell strike again. Spell strike is already 2 actions to attack and cast a spell at the same time, and the spell's effects use the attack's result. So if you hit, the spell hits. But if you miss, the spell also misses, and you will need to spend an action recharging your spell strike. Now luckily subclasses come with focus spells that usually do something and recharge your spell strike, but it is still a super awkward balance of actions of trying to spell strike, recharge it, use your abilities, move around, and just not miss. Very similar to the Gunslinger, if a new player plays a Magus and misses both of their first spell strikes in their first encounter, they're going to have a miserable time. And yes, I've been the GM when a new Magus missed all of their attacks and then went down. I'm sorry, Nathan. Shaka just wasn't meant to live. And that's why I really don't recommend this for new players. Not only does this class require an in-depth understanding of martial and spellcasting combat and character prep, but it also just sometimes doesn't reward you for all of the prep you put into the character. You can make the perfect Magus, but if you roll a 5, you're still going to waste the spell slot, miss the attack, and waste 2 of your 3 actions on that turn, and that feels brutal, especially for new players. We're down to the 6 most beginner-unfriendly classes in the game, starting with the Witch. Now, the Witch is very similar to the Wizard in a lot of ways, with even more going on. So not only are they learning and preparing spells, they also have to deal with their familiar, which is a great feature, don't get me wrong. I don't mean to be negative when I say deal with their familiar, but they need to learn how the familiar works, learn how all their familiar abilities work, which familiars their familiar has, their Witch-specific familiar ability, which goes off whenever they sustain or cast a hex. They have to learn all of their hexes, and similar to the Bard, balance those hexes along with movement and casting their prepared spells. So this is taking the complexities and beginner unfriendliness of multiple classes we've talked about, like the Bard and the Wizard, and putting them all together into one class. It also has vital positioning necessary of their familiar, because when they sustain a hex, yes, the familiar ability activates, but it's typically only going to affect creatures that are adjacent to it. So you're not only controlling yourself on the battlefield, you're also spending actions to move your familiar, which also limits your number of actions to cast your spells and cast your hexes and move. The Witch is so action reliant that it can be really cumbersome at times. So I really don't recommend the Witch for new players, simply because their necessary actions to take on every turn can easily overwhelm somebody. Oracle, I almost don't know if I agree putting this high up on the list. Definitely not for complexity's sake. In the remaster, the new Oracle is pretty simple. You pick your subclass, it comes with a curse, and it comes with level 1 feat, and then you pick some spontaneous spells to cast like a Sorcerer or a Bard. That's just about it. The problem is just that the curse doesn't feel good. And I might get some people disagreeing with me in the comments, but I feel like the Oracle is the only class in the game that penalizes the player for using certain abilities, and a new player should not have that be their first experience. Using their super cool ability should not make them feel weaker and worse, especially depending on which curse they picked. Plus, understanding the whole curse-bound, curse stage thing can be hard to explain to people, especially if they have never played Pathfinder 2e before and don't understand traits and values and such. Complexity-wise, I don't think the Oracle is that hard to play. You're mostly just a full spellcaster with some extra features you get from your feats. So complexity-wise, it's not that bad. It's just that I don't recommend this for beginners, because unless you really know what you're doing, that curse will start to inhibit what you can do, and that's going to feel pretty bad. Next up, the Kineticist. Oh, I hate putting my baby the Kineticist this far up on the list, but it's so true. No beginner, in my opinion, should ever start their PF2 journey with a Kineticist, because if they do, they're going to spend the first 6 hours just trying to understand how their class works. Kineticists are the most overwhelming character creation class in the game, because not only do you have to pick an element, but you also have to pick your feat for that element, on top of the feat for your universal Kineticist, and especially as they start to level up and go beyond level 1, the Kineticist gets a whole lot worse. You need to understand auras, and junctions, and overflow, and channeling, and elemental blasts, which are not considered weapons and don't get upgraded with runes like Hand-Wraps of Mighty Blows. They need their own specific magic weapon or item to upgrade their elemental blast. There is so much with the Kineticist that bends the rules of this system, which is unfortunate, because in actual gameplay, once the character is built, they're really easy to understand. You channel your element, you make an attack roll, you use an impulse, which is basically just a fancy way to say spell, not a spell. They're really simple to play, but very overwhelming, and I don't recommend beginners play a class that bends the rules of the system, especially as hard as the Kineticist. Alright, top 3. I might get some flack for this one. Third least recommended class for beginners, the Summoner. First off, making a Summoner is almost as hard as making a Kineticist, in my opinion. You're basically building 2 characters. You're going to need to find some secondary sheet to fill out to keep your Eidolon's stats separate from your own, because they're different. Their ability scores are different than yours, which means their saving throws are different than yours. And then positioning in combat is even harder and more important than I'd say any other class in the game, because you're positioning 2 characters who have to share 3 actions. Technically, they get 4 actions because of act together, so still, you're playing basically 2 characters who on average get 2 actions each, and the Summoner themselves are probably going to spend their 2 actions casting a spell, because spells are usually 2 actions, so your Eidolon's going to get maybe 1 action to move, 1 action to attack, but then there's all the different abilities and feats you get that interact with your Eidolon and your shared action economy. There is so much going on with the Summoner, and it is definitely the class that in my Kingmaker campaign, even though most of us are pretty experienced PF2 players at this point, we still usually have to pause and search through the books to figure out some minute detail about Eidolons. Eidolons themselves make this class so beginner unfriendly, it writes itself. You know, you are playing two characters who follow different rules. It's way too much for most beginners. Plus, they're a spontaneous caster on top of that, with 4 spell slots per day like the Magus, and their entire list of cantrips. So on top of building 2 characters, you're also building one of them as a spellcaster, which is inherently beginner-unfriendly. The second most beginner-unfriendly class, in my opinion, and I think a lot of people might disagree with me here, is the Psychic. Just like a few other classes on this list, Psychic character creation is very wordy. They have 2 subclasses that you have to choose, a conscious mind and a subconscious mind, which obviously do 2 very different things, and their effects can be very, very elaborate and confusing, even for experienced players. To this day, I still could probably not explain to you without reading it out of the book exactly what the Fire and Ice Oscillating Wave subclass does. Now, luckily the Psychic is a spontaneous caster, so it's not like they have to learn and prepare spells, but the fact of the matter that most of their cantrips have multiple optional effects can be incredibly confusing for beginners. When you tell a beginner to pick your spells, but remember, your cantrips based on your subclass actually have a different effect than when other people use them, and also you can spend a focus point to amp it and change it to a third different effect, can be so hard to explain to someone who only has a very basic understanding of TTRPGs or PF2 as a whole. I can't even imagine trying to explain to someone that, hey, your cantrips are different and you can augment them to be even more different than the original cantrip. Add on to this the entire Unleash Psyche system, which is also hard to understand. My poor friend playing a Psychic thought they had to unleash their Psyche in order to amp their focus spells, which is not the case, but I can see why they thought that. Unleash Psyche is painted as this core ability of the Psychic when it's really not. It's an optional ability you can use to gain an optional bonus effect from one of your subclasses, which is completely unrelated from the amped cantrips you get from your other subclass. Do you see why I put the Psychic this high on the list? It's very convoluted and all over the place with regards to what your spells do, what you can do at any given time, and how to do it. So that is why the Psychic is the second least recommended class for beginners. But y'all already know what the first one is, don't you? You know it. I love it. The 23rd least recommended class in Pathfinder 2e is the Alchemist. You all knew it was coming. Yes, it's technically a martial class because it does not cast spells, but holy cow, it might as well be considered its own unique type of spell casting. There's so much going on right from character creation. You've got your advanced alchemy, which lets you craft things in the day. You've got your versatile vials, which let you craft things during the day, and you find more vials while you're exploring during the day. And you can quick alchemy to create those vials, but they only last 1 round. Or if you already have a vial, you can quick alchemy to create an item of your advanced alchemy type, but it only lasts for 1 round. But you can't quick alchemy to create an item with a vial that was created by quick alchemy. You can only quick alchemy an item if you use one of the vials you got from exploring. Are you lost yet? Not only that, but your subclass augments things you can do with your vials, as well as the types of items you can make, and augments the effects of those items only for that subclass of Alchemist. So not only do you have to understand the mechanics of how creating, manifesting, searching, and gathering more vials and all of that works, but you also need to know all of the alchemical items in your formula book, which might as well be your spell book, and you start with, I think, 8 formulas. So right at level 1, your turn comes up, and you as the alchemist need to decide, do I just throw one of my vials as a bomb? Do I use my special subclass vial benefit? Or do I quick alchemy one of 8 different items I can make on a whim in the middle of this combat? At the end of your turn, you have to spend the entire next round thinking of what you might do on your next turn. You are going to need an actual legitimate, formula book by your side to write down and keep all of your alchemical items in order. The Alchemist is the least recommended class in the game for new players, and it's also one of my favorites. But there we go. There is my list from most to least recommended class for new players to Pathfinder 2nd Edition. What do you think? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? If you are a new player, how has this affected the character you might play in the future? I hope I didn't scare you off of any classes, because that was never my intention, except for the Alchemist. Please don't play an Alchemist. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. I had a lot of fun making it. I went a little bit more loosey-goosey than I usually do. I'm trying to find a little bit more of that old spark I used to have in these videos and having a lot more fun with them. So I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. Thank you again to everyone on Patreon, especially World's Tallest Hobbit, for buying the huge high-tier one-shot. I'm really excited to run that for you and your friends. Thank you all so very much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And until next time, no nat ones.